hold on, Zach. 20 million of them had
Are
jobs.
all 7 million going to get jobs in manufacturing?
In manufacturing and agriculture, wherever it may be.
7 million new jobs? All of them?
Kick out the criminals who came into this country a year ago and took our jobs.
It's not going to offset costs. It's going to increase costs.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Explain
absolutely.
How. Explain how. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural episode of United Debates of America. I am your co-host, Zak Kimball, and this is my other co-host, James Fishback. How you doing, man?
Good to see you. Excited to get this started.
Yeah, this is good. I mean, just so people know what this podcast is supposed to be, we both agree that the one thing that is probably corroding the U.S. the most is the discourse in the U.S., and especially when it comes to debate from the left, which I definitely represent here, and the right, which James definitely represents over there. And we're trying to create a show where we actually have a civil debate. We're probably not going to agree on a lot of different things, but we're going to agree to respectfully disagree. So that's what we're attempting with the show. And, that's why it's called the United Debates of America, because we're hoping that despite our differences in opinion, we can have a civil and united debate.
Well put. I mean, that's true. And I think the United Debates of America, what UDA represents to me, and I know to you as well, Zach, is debate has a power to unify in not some superficial or performative sense, but I think so much of the division and strife in this country comes from just not talking to the other side enough, and then misunderstanding what the facts are or what their motives or intentions are. And then that further polarizes us to the point where, heck, if we find out that our aunt voted for Kamala Harris in this election or our brother voted for Donald Trump, they all of a sudden become these ghosts that we ostracize from our lives. And so I think the hope that I have from what we're building here together, Zach, is that everyone watching will maybe find new ways that they can engage with the other side. And, most debates aren't going to be like this in a formal arrangement. Most debates are going to be around the water cooler or when you have dinner with a friend or a family member, and to speak up during those debates and to defend what you believe, but to do it in a respectful and good faith way.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to try to do here. I'm not sure we'll always achieve that, but I think we're going to try our best to achieve it. I'm sure sometimes we'll get a bit animated, but look, we're going to try our best. So our first topic, given that Trump is about to take office in 13 days, and one of the big topics has been tariffs. So I obviously have a very different belief system on what tariffs are going to do to this country versus what James believes. So we're going to jump into this topic. We'll probably start with tariffs and, expand out, but that's where we're going to start on this one. So I'm going to start with my assertion here that I believe tariffs are going to do the opposite of what Donald Trump promised, because my perspective is that Donald Trump won this election in no small part because of his core promise of lowering prices. And there's no question that most economists agree that tariffs are going to do the opposite of that. Now, look, there are values to tariffs. I think that in the right circumstances, it can be a beneficial tool to be used to affect certain markets. But the way that Donald Trump has proposed tariffs, I strongly believe is going to be bad for all the folks who said, I'm going to vote for Trump because I want more money. Because that's a lot of people who voted for Trump. They didn't vote for him because they like him. They vote for him because they want more money in their bank account. So that's the basis of my assertion. James, I'm sure you probably have the completely opposite perspective on this.
Well, just so we can capture it concisely, your assertion just in kind of one quick punchy thing, what would it be? Trump's tariffs, and then what would that be?
I think Trump's tariffs will increase costs for people who want costs to go down. That would be what I would say. That's my primary assertion. I think it can do a lot of damage to the economy, but I think it's going to depend on how far he goes there. I think if his tariff plans that he's said on the stump are fully realized, I definitely think it could be a devastating effect on the economy. I don't personally believe he'll go that far because I think there's probably enough people in his orbit letting him know, hey, that's not such a good idea. But that could be different this time around. Obviously, his orbit is quite different from his first term. So in general, I would say, realistically, a lot of folks are going to be very disappointed with the outcome of their bank account, given what Trump wants to do here with tariffs.
And so why do you believe that? Why do you believe that Trump's tariffs are going to hurt the average American?
Well, I mean, just economically, when you look at the concept of tariffs, especially the way that he's presenting it, it's an inflationary tactic. And Trump won in no small part because people were feeling the long-term effects of inflation. I mean, inflation itself, the percentage has been solved at this point, but the effect of the inflation of 2022 and 2023 is not going to go away because that's not how inflation works. So people voted for lower prices. And in the end, they're not going to get them from tariffs because tariffs in and of themselves are inflationary. That's just, there's no debate on that. I mean, that is just actually what happens. And when you have broad spectrum tariffs, you can necessarily have a set of circumstances like in 2018, where Trump enacted tariffs on China and specific products, where the inflation only really exists within that product base. But that's not what he's proposing. He's proposing a blanket tariff, which is not going to be deflationary. It'll definitely be inflationary.
What do you think motivates that tariff proposal from Trump? Where do you think, just if you kind of put yourself in his shoes, if
Sure.
you believe what he believes, why do you think he's advancing that?
I
Because
think
certainly
that
he doesn't want to raise prices, right?
no, but I don't. Look, I don't. To be completely honest, I don't think Trump fully understands tariffs. I think that he sees them differently from how economists see them. Right? Economists can understand the full spectrum of what a tariff is designed to do and how it works. Donald Trump sees them in a multitude of ways. I think he sees them in two primary ways that are only part of the picture. One is he wants to reinstate US manufacturing to a large degree. That's definitely a huge factor from Trump's perspective. And the other factor I would say is that he's trying to use them as sort of like a bartering tactic to bring people to the table to have a strategic advantage over them. So, for example, what he's done with Canada and Mexico, saying, hey, if you don't do what I want at the border, I'm going to put a 25% tariff on you. I think that he sees that as a negotiation tactic as opposed to something he actually necessarily wants to do. He sort of uses it as a threat as opposed to something that he thinks is like an economic win. That's just at least my if I were Trump and I'm looking at what I see Trump say and how he tends to act, that's my assumption on why he's doing what he's doing.
Okay, cool. So there's two parts there,
Yeah.
both of which are interesting. The first is domestic manufacturing, which I
Mhm.
think we probably agree is a laudable goal, right? In
Yes,
1980,
absolutely.
20 million Americans were employed in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
Today, 12 million are. The truth is, Zach, that 7 million working age men in this country are not working at a time where they'd have the opportunity to
Sure.
do that in the manufacturing sector, because it's one that doesn't require these huge barriers. It's one that, wherever you come from, wherever you are, whoever you are, you
Mhm.
have the ability to pick it up and to do it and to support your family. And there's huge downstream consequences of the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector in America. So part of it too is, what do we prioritize? Do we want to see domestic employment? And is there some trade-off there for the potential? And I want to stress potential for higher prices. The second
Sure.
point is negotiating leverage, right?
Mhm.
And so to your point, and we actually saw this when he was negotiating the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, in very Trumpian fashion. He has to rebrand everything he puts his hands
Like the
on.
Gulf of Mexico, yeah.
The Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, as we'll be calling it going forward, right?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, Zach, is if you believe, and I believe, that a lot of these tariffs are actually just negotiating leverage by
Mhm.
who I believe is the best negotiator alive right now, which is Donald Trump,
Yeah.
that what happens is that they'll never be ever implemented. And then we'll actually never see the effects. And what's going to end up happening is you're going to force China to come to the table, increase
Mhm.
purchases for US products like agriculture and natural gas. You're going to see Canada and Mexico come to the table. By the way, Canada's done an absolutely awful job when it comes to the northern border. In 2021, there were 300 illegal crossings on the US Canada border. Today, there's over 20,000. It's time for Canada to get its act together. And really, the leverage we have on Canada is pretty clear cut. When they send their billions of dollars of goods over here, we have the ability to tariff them, and that brings them to the table, in a way they
Mhm.
otherwise might not have. And so I think if you care about curbing illegal migration, care about curbing the flow of deadly fentanyl that passes both the northern and southern border,
Mhm.
tariffs are good negotiating leverage. And it looks like already, from what we're seeing with Trudeau's government crumbling, that there is the real potential for them to come to the table, for these tariffs never to actually be used, but for the
Yeah.
positive outcomes that they're decidedly trying to bring about, that those come about, like lower migration and lower drug trafficking.
It's possible, but look, it's a very large risk he's taking. There's no question about that. Because if he says, "Look, I want it this way, otherwise I'm going to tariff you," and they say, "Well, I'm not going to do it the way you want it," he's either going to have to back off his threat, which makes him look weak, and he probably won't do, or he'll have to actually enact those tariffs. So that's one thing. The second thing is Trump is already like, I really push back on this. Trump is the best negotiator for this because he did this already back in 2018, and he lost this situation with China. For example, he made it so he had to end up spending $28 billion to bail out the soybean industry because China enacted a 25% tariff on soybeans after he created these very targeted tariffs, not a blanket tariff, but a targeted set of tariffs on China. And in the end, because he failed to negotiate a better deal with China and they just imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States and our farmers, he had to bail them out to the tune of $28 billion. And that didn't even cover the majority of what they needed to even break even with where they were prior to the tariffs. So I can't imagine that a guy who's tried this before and largely failed. He didn't look. There were some segments where he did okay, and some where he didn't. And in the end, it's sort of a wash. I don't have any sort of confidence that this is the guy who can come in and use a tactic he's tried to use before successfully when he didn't do it successfully in the past.
Well, there's a couple things there. So you're absolutely right that Trump did provide a bailout to soybean farmers because of China's antics. And by the way, that
Well,
bailout
so
was
that's not their antics. I mean, we imposed tariffs on them first. It's retaliatory.
sure. Sure. And by the way, those tariffs more than fully funded what the soybean farmers rightly got from Donald Trump.
It
And so
didn't. It came at the expense of the taxpayer. That's not correct.
well, no, we got tariff revenue. So tariff revenue went from 30 billion to 70 billion under Trump annually. And so
Mm-hmm.
for a $28 billion transfer to soybean farmers in the Midwest, that would have been fully covered by the tariff revenue. Let's not forget, by the way, that until 1913, the only form of revenue, there was no income tax, there was no federal income tax. The way the
Mm-hmm.
federal government raised revenue was largely through tariffs,
Yep,
largely through tariffs.
that's
And
true.
so there's truth to this. We built this country at a time, the majority of this country, at a time where we used tariffs to actually raise revenue. So the revenue that was raised from China to support the soybean farmers. But I'll leave it to this point just for a moment, which is Donald Trump didn't maybe have the best set of cards when he entered office with respect to China and Mexico and Canada. But let's
Mm-hmm.
not forget that the USMCA was positively reformed to the point
Yes.
where you had better support for American workers, better
Yes.
support for companies, increased the threshold for what was necessary to be counted as a foreign sale, right? In
Yeah.
terms of the constituent goods. And also, let's not forget that in the China Phase One trade deal was the biggest trade deal that the U.S. had engaged with China at a
Mm-hmm.
time where when the WTO accepted China in early 2000s, the trade deficit was 100 billion and then it widened out to 350 billion. That trade
Mm-hmm.
deficit actually shrunk about 30 or 40 billion under Trump as well.
That's not
And
true.
so
The trade deficit grew under Trump. When you get to the end of Trump's term, the trade deficit with China was worse than when he enacted the tariffs. We can pull it up in the fact check later, but I'm 100% sure of that. In
okay,
the end, what you're referring to is a period of time where in which that was the case, but that got erased by the end of his term.
perfect. I look forward to clarifying that. I look
To
forward to
say,
clarifying it, right? But so now, what I will say is that what we have to remember more than anything is that tariffs are not a mean to an end, right? Sorry, that tariffs are a mean to an end.
mm-hmm,
That when Donald Trump calls himself tariff man, rather tongue in cheekly, what he's
mm-hmm,
really referring to is the ability to of tariffs to give you negotiating leverage. Zach, the ability of a tariff to say, look, when a country like Turkey imprisons a Christian pastor by the name of Andrew Brunson, and when
mm-hmm.
Trump goes on Twitter and says, hey, Turkey, if you don't release that Christian pastor by the name of Andrew Brunson, we are going to decimate your economy with tariffs. And guess what? What do you know? They hand over the pastor, and those tariffs largely don't go into effect. When you've got other countries that are misbehaving, you have the ability to use tariffs as economic negotiating leverage. But let's not forget, we are the largest economy in the world. We should act like it. And so when we have deadly fentanyl, Zach, coming across the southern border that's killing, without a doubt, killing 200 Americans, young, old, black, white, rural, urban, every single day.
Yeah.
We have leverage over them. We should use that leverage. I think you would
That's
agree
not
that
going to
there's
stop the flow
more
of
that,
fentanyl, though.
okay, well,
It's just not.
look,
It's not a realistic statement. Like I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to frame this in a way where you're saying, okay, we're going to get to the southern border. We're going to stop the southern border from being a problem because we're going to threaten Mexico into a position where they have to come to the table and do what we want on the border. I understand what you're saying, but at the end of the day, the way that you're presenting this is not accurate. Let's first face a simple fact, which is that the border is not at all what the right is framing it to be now. It was back in 2023 horrible. I think Biden did a horrendous job on the border, and you and I can agree on that, I'm sure. But ever since he actually enacted his new, I forget exactly what the date was, back in April. Sometime in April, he enacted the policies that slowed down the stem of the tide at the border. And now crossings are lower than they were under Donald Trump. So if we want to talk about stemming the tide of the border, it's done. It's already finished. So look, I'm not saying fentanyl's not a problem. I'm not saying the border is still not a problem. I'm just saying that it's within the realm that Donald Trump left it in 2020. It's not this nightmare situation that it once was. So what you're trying to say, looping this all back, is that we're supposed to be using this big threat that's going to screw up both of our economies to stop a problem that is no worse than it was 4 years ago. That makes no sense to me. That is a risk that the people that are in trouble in that risk are the American people, because if Trump has to go through with these tariffs, he's tariffing our two largest economic partners, three largest if you want to include Canada, but Mexico and China are our two biggest partners. And if he's forced to go through with this, he's trying to do this for PR essentially. Because if this were 2023, I'd say this is a great idea. We have leverage over Mexico. Let's get in there and force them to come to the table and be aggressive. But now we have a problem that is much more manageable, and we don't need to use this gigantic hammer of a broad 25% tariff to you as a negotiating tactic. And frankly, I don't think it's so smart to become the boy who cried tariffs, because every single time he gets in these situations, he just goes, just tariff them. It's like, they're going to see that coming. And the worst thing you can do in a negotiation is just have your position be completely obvious. And eventually people are going to go, look, if he wants to go into a retaliatory tariff situation, fine, we'll do it, which is what Mexico is currently doing. Mexico, unlike Canada, who did just completely go, you know what, fine, we'll go and do whatever you want to do because you're right, their government's falling apart. Mexico went the opposite way and said, you want to do this? Good luck. And they're planning to retaliate with it, and that's going to be bad for the American people. So we're already seeing before he's in office, this tactic is not 100% successful. It's 50% successful, and the wrong 50% we're losing on right now, because I'd much rather have this tariff on Canada than Mexico. So to me, I look at the situation and go, on paper, broad strokes, sure, it makes sense as a potential tactic to do this. But when you get down into the nitty gritty of like, okay, what if they don't want to play ball? What if they don't want to get bullied by America, which a lot of countries don't? That's going to be very bad for the American people.
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily want Mexico and Canada to be hit with tariffs, but if they want to continue doubling down on the I guess refusal to acknowledge the problem. Here's the truth, Zach. Fentanyl deaths are higher today than they were 4 years ago.
Sure.
Migrant crossings are higher today than they were 4 years ago. The fact, by the way, that President Biden reinstituted President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy
Yeah,
this
it was a
summer.
smart policy. It
It
was
was a
good. I
smart
agree with it.
policy. And by the way,
Yep.
I'm glad that he did it as opposed to eliminating it on day one when he took office in 2021. That was
Yep.
stupid. That was virtue signaling. And that unleashed, sorry to say, that unleashed an invasion. It's an invasion of the southern border. And so look, I don't want us to rest on our laurels. The truth is that Mexico can be doing more. And I'm not just talking about migrants. I'm
Well, what
talking
specifically? What specifically does Trump want them to do?
Well, look, you've got local police, local military in Mexico that can prevent people from advancing northward. You have
Mm.
a border that Mexico has south of it. They just don't have a border with the United States. They have a border south of it that they themselves can secure. Let's not forget, by the way, that most people crossing over the U.S.-Mexico border are not Mexican. They're
Sure, they're
not.
coming from South America
190
or
countries,
Central America.
190 countries were represented in the illegal crossings over the past year. And so that's
Sure.
everything from Siberia to Nigeria, whatever it may be. And so a couple things Mexico can do right off the bat is they can deny passage of people into the country from the south, crossing through the Darien Gap, whether they're from Colombia or Venezuela or whatever. They can
Hmm.
secure their southern border, which they're just not doing effectively enough. The other thing they can do, by the way, is wait, why is this guy from Nigeria taking a one-way trip to Mexico? Why don't we put a higher visa or a higher standard and threshold on him? Because he may be using this trip to Mexico simply to advance illegally into the United States.
So
And so,
would Trump pay for this? Because I mean, in the end, what we're doing is going into Mexico and saying, "Hey, I know you're a sovereign country, but we're going to tell you how to run your southern border." So is
well,
Trump going to give them the resources to do that?
Mexico certainly has the resources to do it. There's no question about
But
it.
they have no incentive to like that's the thing. I understand what you're trying to loop back to, which is we're giving them the incentive to do this by threatening their economy. But at the same time, if they don't do that, then what's the next move? Because we don't have the ability to just go in and say, "Hey, Mexico, do what we say." They have no vested interest in controlling our border. Then they don't really, they have a different set of belief systems A, and B, circumstances, because you're right, a lot of them just pass through Mexico and keep going. It's a different set of circumstances. So my challenge with this argument is like, okay, all that sounds fine, and we can agree on a lot of this stuff, but we're telling a sovereign nation what to do with its border, and that's a terrible idea. We know, we would never accept that. Why should Mexico?
Well, we're telling a sovereign nation to do something with its border that will save American lives.
But
Lake
they
and
don't care
Riley
about
will be
American
alive.
lives.
Well, they should. They should. I
Do we
mean,
care about Mexican lives though? We don't seem to.
I
I mean,
absolutely
your
care.
side certainly. I mean, I don't look. Let's be honest. The
I
MAGA side
certainly.
does not care about Mexican lives. They couldn't give a shit about the whole. Why the whole way that you guys treat the border is you treat these folks like they're not even people. You just call it the border issue. It's not an immigration issue. It's just the border. People don't care about the illegal immigrants. They chastise them and treat them like they're evil across the board when only a very small percentage of them are even criminal. So how am I supposed to believe that why would they care about us when we clearly don't care about them? It's
Well,
a double standard to believe that that's how we should do it.
well, look, I tell you that I deeply care about this issue because I view actually illegal migrants as victims in this entire thing as well. I view
Sure.
the fifth generation Chicagoan family who is not doesn't have enough money to put a roof over their head, but all of a sudden these migrants who get bussed in 48 hours ago get $5,000 a month, as they do in Brennan Johnson, Chicago. But those very people, and the New York Times has reported on this in 22 and 23, those very illegal migrants were put to work. One young man from Guatemala lost his arm at a meat processing plant working the midnight shift. The article is literally titled "Kids Who Work the Midnight Shift: Big, Greedy Globalist Corporations Taking Advantage of Cheap Migrant Desperate Labor and putting them to work is un-American, it is wrong, and it's greed, unmitigated greed. So
Sure.
I don't know how other Republicans view this issue. I know that almost every Republican I've spoken to actually does care about the people, especially, by the way, 1 out of 3 women who make the journey to the US southern border will be sexually assaulted. So
That's true.
I've seen many Republicans speak out about against that. Here's the
Good.
truth. Most people who come to this country are not fleeing persecution. There's no civil war. There's no civil war. There's no
Hmm.
persecution. They are not legally, legitimately claiming amnesty. They are
Yeah.
economic migrants.
Yeah. They're
They want
seeking
to come to
opportunity.
this country because they can stay at a $400 a night hotel for $0 a night. They can get free healthcare, a free cell phone. They can get food stamps in New York City, and they can work, not because they want to, but because they have to. And these multi-billion-dollar corporations like Uber and DoorDash treat them like disposable commodities and not like God's great creation that they are. And so I would just reject the notion that there are good people on both sides, to use a term that President Trump used. There are good people on both sides of this issue, and I view them as actually victims in this as well. The coyotes, the human smugglers, the rapists who take advantage of these people seeking a better way of life. The
Hmm.
truth is, though, Zach, that this is a giant scheme because these people would be better off, safer off, staying in their own countries as
How is that
opposed to
possible?
coming here. Well, I'll tell you how it's possible. My mother's from Colombia. I was there this past summer. I asked a lot of people if they were given the opportunity to come to the United States, folks who owned businesses who would be considered among the affluent in this small industrial town, if they
Hmm.
would come to the United States, and every single one of them, without hesitation, said yes. And the reason why is because of the GDP and the economic gap between our two countries. We
Sure.
could develop the heck out of Guatemala, Siberia, Nigeria, Liberia. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we are the greatest economy in the world, and there's
Yeah.
going to be 1 billion people in the world who, if given the opportunity, would migrate to the United States. And so, to come
Sure.
full circle here, we've got to be honest with these people. If you come here, you will be a slave to billion-dollar corporations that in one breath will say DEI, woke, BLM nonsense, and in the other breath will use that young 14-year-old boy from Guatemala that was profiled by the New York Times and treat him like a disposable commodity. And so that's the kind of virtue signaling them against. And again, to come full circle here, use tariffs, President Trump. Use those tariffs if it means securing the border, getting Mexico to finally stop the greatest human trafficking scandal in history. And look, by the way, Zach, either Mexico does this or they don't. If they don't, we deserve, I'm going to use a word that maybe some on the left don't like or maybe use in their own sense. We deserve reparations. That's what tariffs are. They're reparations.
That's
If
not going to happen.
Mexico is going to poison our people, If Mexico's going to let the Sinaloa cartel poison our people and let millions of people come into our country, we want our money back because we got scammed, and we're going to get that money back with tariffs.
There's a lot to unpack in that. Look, I'll start with this. If it was the way you're framing it, if it was that they're coming here to be slaves and it's going to be awful here, they wouldn't do it. Simple as that. There's been tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of folks who have made this journey over the last, let's say, 100 years. If it was true that when they get here, they're just going to be completely slaves to big corporate America, they would not come here. They come here because, in the end, even in that set of circumstances, they will make far more money than they would in their home country. And it is truly an economic opportunity they're doing here. So I reject this notion that it's so bad that they would be better off where they came from, because if that were the case, they wouldn't come. There wouldn't be this gigantic demand for these folks in this country based on how our current economic structure is. For example, in agriculture, if we do what Trump is trying to do, agriculture is going to be very, very expensive by comparison to the past, because we are currently doing what you're describing. We're underpaying folks to do those jobs. There's no question about it. They're not slaves, they're getting paid. But that market is going to get absolutely decimated if those people disappear. And the reason they're even here is because that wage they get paid is better than what you're describing. It's not like they're all getting this inhumane treatment. They're coming here and getting a better deal than they would have gotten where they came from. So that's the first thing I want to respond to. The second thing I want to respond to is this idea that fentanyl is strictly a border problem. That's ridiculous. Fentanyl is not a border problem. Fentanyl comes across the border, yes, but hey, let's acknowledge a simple thing. People who choose to use opioids and heroin and fentanyl in this country, that is a personal choice they're making. Whether or not Mexico floods the market with it or not, it's going to exist. People are going to get it. It comes through ports of entry more often by far than it does through migrants crossing. So even if you were to address the border issue in a major way, you would still just put a tiny dent in the fentanyl issue, because the fentanyl issue is usually coming through legal ports of entry, not on a human being, but in large quantities. And that is not what this is solving. This is not at any way addressing that. So this fentanyl argument, I understand why the right does it. They do it to try to tug on the heartstrings and make it seem a little bit more dangerous than it actually is. But fentanyl is largely not being smuggled in through people. It's being smuggled in through legal ports of entry on, usually ships. So that's just one thing to address there. The whole concept of tariffs being reparations. Okay, I can understand that argument, but the challenge that I have with it is that who is paying the price for those reparations? The American people are going to pay that price, because the cost is going to be passed on to them. The cost of tariffs. I think, unfortunately, I found this when I was doing a bunch of work, on my social media channels as the election was going on. Republicans, on average, and look, it's not everybody, but on average, don't understand how tariffs work. Most of them were surprised to find out that the US company is the company that's charged for that tariff. So in the end, if the US company is the company that's going to be charged for that, their product is going to get more expensive. It's as simple as that. And that means that these reparations are being paid for out of the pocket of Americans, not by Mexico. So that, to me, is a suite of like really nice sounding rhetoric that isn't actually true.
So there's a lot there. The first is that the fentanyl is manufactured in Mexico using precursors from China. So there's
Mm-hmm.
multiple points there. So even if, and by the way, 40% of the fentanyl in the United States comes through the southern border. Yes, you're right, through legal ports of entry. By
Mm-hmm.
the way, Mexico is also responsible for those legal ports of entry on their
Sure,
side. So they ought to
but
secure them as well. So
yeah,
I
it
remember
doesn't
that
solve
remember
it.
the tariffs are not on illegal Mexicans. The tariffs are on Mexico, where
Sure.
they can do more enforcement. So that's number
Mm-hmm.
one. Number two, again, the precursors are coming from China. They're coming into Mexican ports on the Pacific Ocean that
Mm-hmm.
clearly are not secure enough, or are not, the contents of those imports are not being vetted thoroughly enough. And then three, we need to have a better job actually policing the activity, and Mexico has to do it. We can't police the interior of Mexico, but the Mexican government can crack down on the kind of corruption that allows this to happen. The
Sure.
second point is that of the fentanyl deaths, what's so staggering about this is that most people who die of fentanyl did not actively seek out fentanyl.
Of course
It's
not.
been extensively reported that they're found in counterfeit pills, from everything from an Adderall
Sure.
to a Vicodin to an opioid prescription pill. And
Absolutely.
so, look, if heaven forbid, when I was 17 years old, had a sip of whiskey and that whiskey was adulterated, as whiskey often was during the Prohibition period, and
Yeah,
I
I don't know.
died. I don't think people would go to my parents and say, well, he was 17. He shouldn't have been having the whiskey. He would
But
have
there was no
died.
prohibition. You're making up an if this were the 20s, sure, but this isn't the 20s. Nobody's
My,
putting
my, my
fentanyl in
point
whiskey.
is my point is Americans are allowed to make a mistake. 15
Sure,
years ago, if you tried an Adderall in college, you wouldn't have died. Today,
you still
today,
probably
and the
won't.
DEA has reported this. The DEA has reported this, that you're more likely to find an Adderall that is fake, a fake Adderall, a
Sure.
counterfeit Adderall that's
Mhm.
pressed with an active ingredient of fentanyl that kills, oftentimes the very first time, right? 80%, according to the CDC, of
Mhm.
adolescent overdose deaths in America from fentanyl were first time overdose ever. That
Sure.
shows you this is not a pattern of behavior. This is the first time.
No,
Luke
I'm not. I
Emanuel.
never said it was a pattern of behavior. I'm saying it was a choice. That's
Well,
it. It was a choice, even
it
though it was a
wasn't,
bad
but it
choice.
wasn't. It wasn't a choice to gamble with their lives. It was a
Sure,
choice
it
to
is. If
experiment.
you're buying any kind of drug off of a drug dealer, because you can get like you're not going to go to the pharmacy and get Adderall and it's going to be laced with fentanyl. That's just not happening. You have to go to a drug dealer. So what you're describing is a situation where a person has decided to go to a drug dealer to illegally purchase a drug, and then you're telling me that that's just a bad choice. That's a really bad choice. So I'm not saying that they deserve to die for making that decision, and I'm not saying that fentanyl's not a problem, but the way it's being cast is not accurate. Like this is the threat of this and the decision making process is out of whack with how you're describing it. There's no question about that. And like fentanyl is an issue, but opioids in general are an issue across the board. Like this is a much larger issue
Well,
than just
fentanyl
fentanyl.
deaths are 85% of all opioid overdose deaths. So this is not a minority
Yeah.
part of the
No,
issue.
it's
This is
not a
a
minority issue,
huge,
but at the
huge
same
part of
time,
the issue.
people
Fentanyl was
don't.
nowhere to be found 15 years ago,
No,
right?
but fentanyl is not where people start. People start with opioids, right? So if you can, like, I understand what you're saying. There are people who end up taking drugs that they don't expect fentanyl to be in, and they die from that. But that's not the majority of fentanyl deaths. The majority of fentanyl deaths are taking something that you would expect fentanyl to be in, and the only reason that's the case is because they've graduated from opioids to heroin, or they have it within their opioids themselves. But if we address the opioid issue, that's a much better way to stop fentanyl deaths than going after the border. Because in the end, the border is not going to solve this problem. It
Well,
can
it's
maybe mitigate it, but it's not going to solve it. Solving it is attacking the opioid crisis.
well, the tariffs are not over the border. The tariffs are over migration and fentanyl. And so that doesn't just start at the border, that ends at the border, but there's
Yeah,
so much happening in the interior. There's so much happening whether these cartels are producing these pills and allowing the import of these precursors from China. Oh, hey, a giant ship of Chinese chemicals just arrived in Baja California. Oh, gee, let's stop that. Oh, no, the port official got paid off 10 grand to allow it in.
yeah,
That's the
that
kind of
happens.
conduct that we need to stop. And so,
Absolutely, we could
look,
agree on that.
the drug supply has never been deadlier in America, number one.
True.
Number two, it's never been cheaper to have access to these types of illegal drugs. And number three, as we're seeing with class action lawsuits against Meta and Snapchat, that these drug dealers are using these ultra viral platforms targeted toward adolescents.
Sure.
Here's the fact is that if that kid 15 years ago, nobody died from taking an Adderall, nobody died from taking a line of Coke. I mean, these were
Of course
risky
they did.
drugs. They
Coke
were
is a
risky
risky drug. You could
drugs.
you can die from a cocaine overdose. That's pretty easy to do.
Overdose deaths in America have gone up 5x
Of
over the
course,
last
because
10
fentanyl
years.
is extraordinarily difficult to dose. I mean, that's
Correct.
just
But
the
my
bottom line.
point is that the number of drug users has actually slightly declined and
Sure.
the drug deaths have skyrocketed. So what you're
Absolutely.
seeing, Zach, isn't more people saying, gee, I want to put a revolver to my head and play a game called Russian roulette.
Of
What
course
you're
not.
seeing is a drug supply that's been made more lethal by
Mhm.
the inability of countries like Mexico to actually stop what's happening. I'll tell you right now, by the way, if there were some meth dealers in Texas who were sending stuff down to Mexico that was killing kids left, right, and center, we would have an obligation to send the Texas State Patrol, to send the local authorities, to send the FBI to go shut that down. And we
Sure.
absolutely should, and we really would do that. And
Absolutely.
so, I mean, I think
Wait,
that's
hold on. I have a question though, because what you're framing is that this is on Mexico to solve this problem, whereas in the end, the last folks between that shipment of fentanyl and America is American Border Patrol, not Mexican Border Patrol. You're not going through Mexican Border Patrol to enter America. You're going through American Border Patrol. So why is the burden not on us to invest in our own border security to stop this problem? Why are we putting the burden on Mexico? It's a genuine question.
well, we don't have to choose. Actually, we don't have to choose. Remember, we are the last line of defense, and I thank the courageous men and women who work at the Customs and Border Patrol as well as at ICE to try to stop these bad people and these bad drugs from coming into our country. But I'll
Mhm.
also say this, that there are multiple levels to this. From the time, by the way, go back to China for a second. China knows where all these labs are. Funny enough, a lot of them are in Wuhan, which is the second scourge that that little city has sent out to the world. And so I think the issue is that we need everybody to play a role, whether you're a Mexican agent working the customs side of ships coming in from China with fentanyl precursors, whether you're the police that's obviously corrupt in Mexico, cracking down on these cartels, cooking up fentanyl in backyards and pressing them into pills that look identical, Zach, that look identical to the
But this,
very
but
drugs that artists like Drake, The Weeknd, and dare I even say P. Diddy, who's making maybe some new friends in that little jail cell of his,
he
that
probably
they
is.
glorify on this music. And so, look, here's what I want, and I don't think it's controversial. I want every single person involved in that process to put their big boy pants on, to take accountability. We're doing it on our side. President Trump will recommit to that on
But we're,
January.
but we're not, though. That's the thing. That's what I want to cycle back to, is that in the end, you don't need to do this tariff threat and all this stuff to on Mexico. All we need to do is reform our own border policy. You don't have to take the tack that we started this argument on of, we need to put a 25% tariff on Mexico to get them to play ball to stop this problem. Not true. We need to invest more resources into our own border infrastructure. That is fully under Trump's control, and I expect him to do that.
We
But the
should
way but it's not
absolutely do
framed
that
that
too.
way.
We
But
should
it, but the
absolutely do that too.
we should only
Justin
do that.
Trudeau, Justin Trudeau had never got on a plane quicker than he did when Donald Trump
Of
threatened
course,
him on
because
behalf of the American
but that's
people.
not Trump. Don't give Trump credit for that. We all know Trudeau is flailing and barely alive as it
No,
was before
no.
Trump got
Well,
elected. Trudeau is in a terrible
what
set
I'm
of
saying
circumstances.
is, within hours of Trump tweeting that Canada better get its act together, he was on a private plane on his way to
Sure,
Mar-a-Lago,
of course he
having, by the
is.
way, the Donald J. Trump burger, which I highly recommend. It's medium well is the way I go with it. Great fries at Mar-a-Lago. I was there last week. But what I will say, Zach, is the following. That one, I don't think we're necessarily disagreeing here. Everybody has a role to play. President Trump will lead a massive reinvestment to secure the southern border. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, whether it's Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum or former Prime Minister of the 51st state of Canada, Justin Trudeau, both of them felt an urgency they had never felt before when Trump, and that urgency, by the way, should not be
Scheinbaum didn't. Scheinbaum doesn't give a shit.
look,
She's being very aggressive towards Trump. Trudeau fell on his face, but that's exactly why he resigned. But Scheinbaum could give a fuck what Trump has to say. Pardon my language. She is
remains to
not
be
doing
seen.
that. Oh no, it's
Remain,
been seen.
remains to be seen.
But
But look,
here's the thing though. Why is it that Trump is focusing on this very risky negotiation tactic and this potential huge tariff that's going to hurt the people who voted for him for lower prices, give them the opposite thing, when he can just reinvest into our border? Why do we have to make it this big risky negotiation? It seems like, just to me, and probably a lot of people who support what I have to say, a PR stunt, not an accurate description of what's going on, not an actual necessity, not a first step that a average thinking person would take, but instead a PR stunt to try to be aggressive with who should be an ally, but in the end is going to turn into potentially at least a borderline adversary if we're going to behave this way, when a ton of the burden of this problem, because it's an American problem, is on America. And we're acting as if the burden needs to be more so on Mexico to come to the table, where in Mexico, they're their own country. They don't have to do anything. We have the ability to invest heavily in increasing our border patrol, changing the way we handle judges on the border, increasing the amount of scrutiny put on points of entry to stop things like fentanyl. We have the capacity and the money to do that now. And that's not what's being pitched. I agree that Trump will do it, but instead the pitch is, hey, Mexico, I'm going to put a 25% tariff on you if you don't come and solve this problem. It's like, it's not our problem. It's your problem, America. And that's exactly what they're saying. And that's why I look at this as a flawed tactic. Tariffs aside, it's not a good negotiating tactic. It's a stupid way to approach an actual problem, when in reality he could solve it pretty easily just by reallocating funds and having the Congress that he is going to have fully behind him signing off on a bill that's going to go, sure, let's invest a ton of money into our border, because that's exactly what's going to happen. So why do we need, all cycling all the way back, why is it even necessary to have this big, risky tariff threat on top of the American people who are already struggling to make ends meet? Why would you potentially risk that getting worse when you can solve this problem without that involved?
So, a couple things. What's risky is continuing to do absolutely nothing while 100,000 Americans die every year and our border is being invaded.
But I'm
That's
not saying do
actually
nothing. But I never said do
what
nothing.
I'm saying, but that's actually risky. Number two is President Trump wants to leave it all on the field, as we should. Yes, we're going to have historic reinvestments to secure the southern border, but at the same time, Mexico, for their own sake, should stop allowing the imports of these Chinese precursors, should cut down on the cartels, should actually root out corruption in their police, which certainly is complicit
Well, the
in
precursors are
in
legal.
what's happening. Well, look, fentanyl precursors coming from Wuhan that are used to cook up fentanyl in a backyard barbecue
We don't
in
know
the
where it's going. I
lower
mean, fentanyl
Mexico.
fentanyl is a it's used in medicine. It's not
Yeah,
it's not
but
like it's
yeah,
made up.
well,
It's not
I
something where the
agree, but
precursor is
it's
terrible.
typically not sent from a lab in Wuhan on the back of a cargo haul in the
Sure it
form of
is.
an actual pre. No, but what I'm saying is that Mexico has no legitimate fentanyl production. It's not like this stuff is being imported for
I'm sure they
legitimate
probably
production
do.
of fentanyl patches.
I want to look into that because I don't know the answer, but I imagine Mexico probably has fentanyl production. But who knows? I'll look it up. Anyway, I understand what you're saying. I do, and I the challenge that I have with all of this is that, like you just said, this leave it all in the field mentality. To the people on my side of the aisle, the left side of the aisle, we look at that and go, that's not a good strategy because you're just throwing out a bunch. Like that's what Trump does. I mean, Trump just throws 1,000 options out there and waits for one to hit. And then he pretends like he's a genius for that one hitting, even though 9 missed in one hit. That's not a good strategy. And especially, and to me, like I'm fine with it in some spaces when the risk is low. Fine. But when the risk is that people who are struggling to pay their bills are going to have more struggle, that's not a risk worth taking. And that's where I understand all the subsequent things you're talking about and the fentanyl risk and all that stuff. But in the end, those are very complex issues that this is not going to solve. And acting as if it's going to me, is disingenuous.
Look, I would say that leaving it all in the field means you put every option on the table and you used
Mhm.
it. We have real economic leverage. Mike Trump has said that on January 20th, unless they've made a good faith effort to stem these issues, to stem this influx of drugs and migrants, that these tariffs will go into effect. And by the
Yeah.
way, Mexico and Canada can avoid this from happening. They
But
can
then what's going to
absolutely
happen?
avoid
What's
it.
going to happen when that goes into effect? What's going to happen to people in this country?
What's going to happen is you're going to be able to collect revenue. You'll be
Who?
able to collect
Not
revenue.
people. The government will, but
The
people won't.
government will, yeah, of course, the government will collect revenue and use that billions of dollars in revenue to fund the sorts of programs that are offering aid, assistance, and relief to people who are being upended by these two crises, the migrant crisis
Give me
and
one
the
example.
fentanyl crisis.
Give me one example of an actual concrete policy Donald Trump has put forward to do that, because so far the Republican Party has done the opposite of that. Because in order to pay for Donald Trump's, and I'm going to say this, you should really hear this, $5 trillion tax cut that he's selling over the next 10 years. When the party is asked how they're going to pay for it, a lot of these things you're talking about, they're going to reinvest into with this tariff revenue. They're going to cut them to afford. They won't still won't be able to afford that $5 trillion package, but they're going to cut a lot of these programs you're talking about. So tell me a concrete way in which they're actually planning to use this revenue to reallocate it to make people's lives better, because I have not seen anything like that in any sort of Donald Trump orbit of what he's planning on doing.
Well, there's a number of programs at the HHS level that provide relief, that provide services to those who are being directly
Of
affected
course there are, but
by
has
the
Trump said
surge
he's
of
going
fentanyl.
to
Well,
reinvest in
I
them?
don't know that Trump has rolled up his sleeves and directly tied specific tariff revenue line items with specific line items at HHS. The reality is that tariff revenue becomes a general appropriation, becomes a general pool of capital that can be used by the federal government. He used it in certain cases to reimburse soybean farmers for being ripped off by China. But what I will say is we have an economy that is incredibly strong, when we
Mhm.
have an ability to use that economy to negotiate in a way that helps Americans, we're not doing this because he wants to get Mexico to do something that's not in Americans' best
But how
interest.
does it help America?
It's in America's best interest to ensure that our border is secure and that drugs aren't pouring into our communities.
But I'm
Black,
not
white,
asking that question. I'm asking financially. How does it help Americans?
when your
It
dad
doesn't.
dies of an addiction and now you're
That's not an
homeless.
answer to the question. How does it financially help Americans? Like you can use a specific example of somebody having a tragedy, fine. On the macro level, how does this help Americans with their finances?
How does what help Americans with their
Tariffs.
minds?
How do tariffs on China and Mexico, how is this going to help the average person who went into a voting booth in November and voted for Donald Trump and held their nose voting for him because they remember pre-COVID time when he was better for their pocketbook and misunderstood the whole concept of economics and said, all right, I'm going to vote for this guy because he promised he's going to make me more money. How does it help that regular person?
So, what Donald Trump actually promised was increasing your prosperity. And one way to do that, by the way, for the 7 million working age men who are not working, is to use tariffs to incentivize companies to do something a little radical. Didn't used to be, but actually hire American and build in this country.
It's
7
also,
million, 7 million working age men, Zach, who
yeah,
are not working when these companies ship jobs
they're not all
overseas.
qualified to do these jobs. Let's just be honest about that. And frankly, the reason why this is also bad for Americans. What you're pitching right now, U.S. based manufacturing out of just thin air, is terrible for the average American
Well, we
because
we certainly
it,
wasn't terrible in the 60s and 70s. It
yeah,
wasn't
I know
certainly
because
terrible
because that
in
was
the
the
90s.
infrastructure. That was the infrastructure of how the country is built. Right now, the country is founded on neoliberalism. That's just how it is. We
Well,
are
that's a
but that
mistake.
can change. And I'm not saying I agree with you. It's a mistake. But what you're selling is a overnight polar shift, which can't happen because essentially what you're going to do is quadruple the price for almost everything. If you're going to swap out $1 an hour Mexican labor or $1 an hour Chinese labor for $15 an hour United States labor, you are going to have a massive price problem on your hands. And yes, you're gonna give some people manufacturing jobs in this country, but what you're neglecting to mention is that the folks who are getting those jobs are going to be paid more by these companies, and these
Good.
companies are going to have to
Americans should
charge
be
you
paid
more.
more. They
I
deserve it.
agree
They
with you,
deserve to
but at
be
the
paid more.
same time, you know who's going to pay the price for that American getting paid more and having a job is you and me and the people who voted for Trump for lower prices. They're not going to get lower prices; they're going to get higher prices from this. We can achieve this goal without doing tariffs. He can use incentives, tax incentives to have companies,
Well, I thought
and
you
he
were against
should.
the tax cuts. He just said that we're going
I'm
to
not
lower
against the tax cuts.
taxes.
I'm against the way in which he's planning to pay for them. I'm fine with tax cuts if you can justify the payment, but he cannot. Just like he did with his first $2 trillion in tax cuts, which were never paid for and added to the deficit. I mean, Trump acts like he's this, incredible guy for the deficit. He did $1 trillion more than Biden did in COVID spending, and he spent $2 trillion on tax cuts we couldn't afford, and it barely benefited regular people anyway. These are the kinds of things where it's like when you get through the black and white and the bullshit, arguments that people make, these are not beneficial things for Americans. Americans are going to struggle, even if it comes, yes, there's a million new jobs in manufacturing people. It's not going to offset costs. It's going to
Oh,
increase costs.
absolutely,
It's,
absolutely,
it's explain how.
absolutely.
Explain how.
Well, let me put it to you this way: would you rather pay more for your air fryers and T-shirts, or would you rather have Americans have good paying jobs? It's a
That's a,
trade-off. By the way,
no.
there's no right or wrong
The
answer. There's
framing
no
the
right or
framing
wrong
of that
answer.
question is so in
Well,
such bad faith though, because it's not just air fryers and whatever else you just said. It's 1,000 other products. It's everything. So
So
when you
so
ask,
12%, only
so let
12% of the consumer basket, the stuff that we buy, only 12% of it is an imported good. I'll tell you, I'm
that's
here in
not
Orlando,
accurate.
Florida. I'll tell you right
That's
now,
not accurate.
in the CPI basket by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 12% is an imported good. I've been in Orlando for a couple days now. I haven't bought a single imported good. I went to McDonald's this morning for breakfast. I went to Starbucks for a coffee. I drove in my car, which was made here in America. I put on my jeans that were made here in America. So I'm struggling. Like when you go to a services place, you get a haircut, you go pay your lawn guy, whatever it may be. We're a services based economy. You don't necessarily import services, you import goods. And so to begin with, we don't actually import that many goods that are part of our day-to-day consumption. And the second part,
98% of clothing, 20% of food. Yes, meta on the macro, 15% of is imported. But there are industries that are going to get dramatically more expensive.
yeah, I don't
And we're at food
yeah,
prices were a primary driver of this whole the way
yeah.
the election played
Hold
out.
on. What percentage of food is imported?
20.
Okay, so 80% isn't. I mean, we'll
Okay,
adapt.
so
We'll be fine. We'll be fine. We'll adapt.
20%. Do you understand how big 20% of 350 million people's food is? It's a
And seven
gigantic number.
7 million working age men from Baltimore to Biloxi,
But they're
they
not all going
deserve
to
the
have jobs.
dignity.
You're acting like
They
everybody's going to get
deserve well,
converted into this.
20. Hold on, Zach. 20 million of them had
Are all
jobs
7 million going to
recently
get jobs in manufacturing? Answer that question.
in manufacturing and agriculture, wherever it may be. Here's
Seven
my
million new
solution.
jobs.
Kick out,
All of them.
kick out the criminals who came into this country a year ago and took our jobs from places, from workers who would actually deserve them, who paid into a system, who are educated in this country, who have called this country home, by the way, who are not of
They didn't
one
take it.
unique race, who are not of one use, but for all races or from all walks of life. So if you ask me right now,
Oh.
gun to my head, would I spend an extra $1,000 a year if it meant that half of those 7 million people actually got jobs in this country? Without a doubt.
Yeah, you
Because the
would because you have
downstream
money. But
effects,
the average person can't lose that $1,000. That's my
well,
point.
but
Is
hold
I'm
on.
lucky enough, and hold on, I'm lucky enough, and you're lucky enough for that $1,000 to not matter. But the people who voted for Trump are the people where that $1,000 matters tremendously.
Well,
So this
this is
whole idea that you will do it and I'll do it, great. I agree with you. I would do it too. But I make a lot of money, and you make a lot of money. There's a ton of people in America who do not. And if you say, "Hey, would you trade $1,000 for other folks to have jobs?" They go, "No, get away from me. Absolutely not."
Well, you know who doesn't have money? The 7 million working age men who don't have jobs, who did have jobs 30 years ago. They don't have any money.
But
They
you're
don't have
acting
any
like
money.
it's not the same
By
guys.
the way, they don't have any money and their families are suffering as a result of it. And so
They have
again,
money.
my solution is simple. My solution is simple. Yes, I loved that my air fryer I got at Costco 2 weeks ago was 45 bucks. I
Mhm.
loved that. And guess what? It was made in China. I'm afraid to admit it was made
Sure,
in
of
China.
course it was.
But if that air fryer, which by the way, there's no reason we cannot manufacture air fryers. It's not like China
It's
has
going to
some
cost more.
IP monopoly
Of
on
course
air
not. It's
fryers.
just going to cost more. That's it.
Fine.
But yeah,
But
but fine for
fine.
you,
But
not
but
for the average person. That's the
but
point.
again, the average person, Zach, the average person is not in a position where they're actually earning. So when you think about it this way, I'm actually not so much concerned about prices. I'm concerned about the aggregate economy. If you take the average person and say, look, your husband's not working and your prices are going to go up by, let's say, 5 to 10%. But now your
Mhm.
husband is going to have a job, and that's going to bring in $50,000, $60,000 of income every single year that did not exist. That is a net good thing. So, by the way, you're right. You're right that if we put tariffs on, that prices will go up because the cost of
100%.
the domestic manufacturing is a
Much,
lot cheaper.
much
Sorry, is a lot
higher.
more expensive
Yeah.
than using Uyghurs and just throwing Uyghur after Uyghur at the air fryer on the manufacturing line. By the way, there's an
Yeah.
inhumanity there that should also be called out, that it's not exactly fair one way or the other. But again, if you ask that person, if you ask me, oh, hey, your parents are going to pay more for stuff, but they're
Mhm.
also going to earn a lot more in the process. It needs to be understood as a holistic assessment.
But you're
It
describing
isn't
4% of the economy because it's 4% unemployment right now. So 96% of people, what you're describing doesn't apply to them,
so.
and that's the
As you
problem I
know,
have with
as
this.
you know, the unemployment statistics, as you know, what does the Bureau of Labor Statistics say? That you're only considered as unemployed if
Mhm.
if you've been looking for work actively
I
for
mean, come
4
on. Are we
weeks.
going to debate the semantics of how we calculate unemployment? We've been
Well,
calculating the
we
same way forever.
absolutely.
It's not a new
Hold on,
thing.
we're absolutely going to debate semantics because guess what? Because guess what? That person in suburban Atlanta who gave up looking for work months ago, she is not technically considered unemployed. So it's absolutely a
Okay, so
flawed
what
statistic.
percentage of people do you think this applies to? It's not the
What percent?
majority. What
What?
you're describing is not the majority. You're not describing the majority of America when you're saying, "Hey, now you can have a job that's going to pay you X amount of dollars, and you have to look for work anymore." Most people are gainfully employed, whether it's one job, two jobs, or three jobs. Most people are in that position. So what you're describing, this hypothetical, is not applicable to the majority of Americans. Whether it's 96% or 70%, I don't care. I'm trying to come up with a system that is better for the majority of people. And what you're describing, this sort of we're going to get more revenue from tariffs. So we're going to have tariffs think cost more money, but in the end, we're going to get some new jobs for people in America. When you look at the macro effect of that, it's bad for the majority of people, not good. It means, like you've admitted, it's going to be more expensive. Yes, some more people will have jobs, but the majority of people are not going to feel the difference in a positive way. They're going to feel the difference in a negative way. And that is going to be the reason why I imagine 4 years from now, Donald Trump will have a horrendous approval rating and people will be pissed off because he promised lower prices. And there's a 0% chance he can deliver it, especially if he wants to go down this road with tariffs.
Well, what I will say is that the economy and the country will be better off if millions of people who don't have work are restored again and given the dignity, purpose
But
of
that's not.
gainful.
But that's exactly what I just described as not being the case. The economy will be worse because the majority of people feel the economy as prices. People didn't vote because if people voted on the health of the economy, Joe Biden would have won in a landslide because
Well,
the
there's more
economic
working age
markers.
men out of work today. So no, I don't think it's
But
necessarily just
the
prices.
economic markers are all great.
Which
Every
ones?
single GDP is better than Trump's. Inflation is 2.7%. Do you want me to continue? The stock market is at all-time highs.
The GDP growth rates,
11.8% for Biden, 7.8% for Trump. Know it off the top of my head. Biden outpaces him by 4%. And that's when you remove the pandemic from it. That's when you remove the pandemic from it. When you add the pandemic back in, the numbers are astronomically worse. But when you don't take out the COVID element of that, and you look at just the first 3 years of Trump's presidency, Biden has outpaced him in GDP by far. It's not even close.
But you do realize, by excluding the pandemic from Trump and not excluding
I excluded from Joe
hit,
Biden as well. 100%. It's from what the recovery.
What did you exclude?
When you exclude 2021 and you exclude 2020, and you look at just the two GDPs, Biden did better than Donald Trump. It's just just the way it is.
What does GDP measure? Because if you go to that single mom in Baltimore and ask her and tell her, hey, GDP is up.
That's
GDP
not what I'm saying. But that's exactly what I'm saying, is that my whole point is that if you are looking at this through the lens of the economy as a whole is good, then Biden would do great because the economy as a whole is good. But what I'm saying is prices are what matter to the average person. And you've just admitted prices will get worse with this approach. That's the whole point.
No,
you did. You said the prices are going to go up. Prices are going to get worse.
What I said was that American manufacturing costs more than using slave labor in Xinjiang, China.
Exponentially more. Which
Okay.
means products.
I don't know about you. I'm against slave labor in all forms.
Absolutely.
I'm against slave labor in all forms. And so, yes, when you pivot from slave labor air fryers to made in America air fryers, that will cost more. It happens to be the right thing to do.
It is. And morally, it's the right thing to do. You're right.
And by the way, morals are good. It is good.
I agree with you. I'm not. Look, I'm fine with it. I'm talking about the people who are not fine with it. The people who will go, you know what? It's been this way for a very long time. I can't afford higher prices. I don't want it. I'm not one of those people. I'll gladly pay more for it.
You're going to potentially, and again, this is assuming that the tariffs go into effect and are not simply used as a negotiating tool as they have been in the past, more often than not used to bring folks to the table and stop their playing of games and their abuse of us. What ends up happening, Zach, is that, think about it. You don't buy air fryers every single day. What do you buy every single day? As you said, 80% of our food, 80% is made right here at home. Made right here at home. Right?
That's a lot of money going out of your pocket. So 80% will stay the same and 20% will get more expensive, which means an aggregate of more expensive food. People didn't vote for more expensive food. That's my point. People don't want that. If Trump had ran on, hey, food's going to cost more money, he would have gotten eviscerated. He didn't, because he said, no, it's all going to be cheaper, which he can't promise anyway. But this whole concept of tariffs is exactly what I'm saying, is that, yeah, you can make it sound like 20%, 80% is bigger than 20%. You're correct about that. But in the end, 80% is not getting cheaper. 80% is staying the same. 20% is getting more expensive, which means that everything on the average is going to get more expensive. That's a problem.
In the Great Depression, prices went down 10%. So if you just looked at the price channel and said, wow, prices are down, things must be doing great. Well, again, it was the Great Depression.
Well, that's not. Economics are bad when prices are down. You want prices to be up. That means the economy is growing.
That's my point. I guess my point is that I just don't look at the price channel and say whatever prices are doing that somehow indicates how the economy.
But that's how voters vote. That's my point.
Well,
I know you're right. You're right. Like, I understand economics just like you do. We both know that's right. What you're saying is correct economically, but we both know that voters don't understand the economy, and they don't feel the economy through that lens.
They understand the economy. I think they understand the economy really well.
Then why did they vote based on prices? They didn't understand inflation. They certainly didn't understand that, because they thought that Joe Biden was to blame for inflation.
Didn't go away. Prices are up 25% from when President Biden.
Then you don't understand inflation, because that's not how inflation works. Inflation is just the percentage of how much something is going to go up in cost. It's not like when inflation goes back down, because we're at 2.7%. At our peak, we were at 9.1%. We're at 2.7% now. The stuff is still more expensive because it's still going up in price. Just the rate at which it's going up in price has gone down. That's inflation. Inflation and prices are two different things.
It's a really interesting way. You're talking to voters who are coming into Walmart, and the way that prices are down and that they were up, and the second derivative of the change.
They don't understand it. That's my point. They don't get it.
But remember,
that's what it is. That's the reality of it.
It's a made up concept.
Why is it
year over year? Well, hold on. Why is inflation year over year as opposed to 5 year over 5 year?
Who cares? It's about if things cost more.
Things cost more today than they did when President Biden assumed the presidency.
Of course,
that is
economic growth.
Well, why did we have 5.9% annual inflation under Biden and 1.8%
Because
annual
he had
inflation under
9.1
Trump?
inflation in 2022. When guess what the global rate of inflation was in 2022? 8.7%. So fractionally higher in America. Who cares?
Does that make it okay?
No, it makes it not Joe Biden's fault.
Well, who
People
cares?
blame Joe Biden for it, and it's not hit like it's a global supply chain problem thanks to a pandemic that affected the entire world. It has nothing to do with the decisions of Joe Biden. And then always the Republicans say, well, it's because of COVID spending. Well, Trump spent way more than Joe Biden did on COVID spending. So across the board, it's a misunderstood issue. People don't understand inflation. You're right. When you try to explain how inflation works to people, it's complicated. I tried all through the election to explain it to people, and some people got it, some people didn't. But in the end, you can't run a campaign on let me explain inflation to you because you're going to lose. And that's what they tried to do. And they did lose. Donald Trump ran on, I'm just going to make things cheaper. But in reality, Trump never explained how because he cannot do it. He can maybe make some effects here and there. Like if he were to lower energy costs, he might be able to have some segments come down in price. But in general, inflation is a good thing. We want 2 to 3% inflation all the time. That's what every economist says. 2 to 3% inflation is what's best for the economy and its growth. So we don't want things to get cheaper because that's very bad for the economy. Trump couldn't tell people that, or else he would not have won. So my point is, Trump lied to get into office by saying, I can make things cheaper. Of course he can't. That's not how it works, unless he wants deflation, which means we'll have a recession or a depression. And like you said, we saw that price point go down 10% during the Great Depression because it was the Great Depression. It's the same thing. Look at that, the Smoot-Hawley Act. You want to go back to tariffs? That was a terrible decision. We brought back tariffs in a big way during the Great Depression, and it exacerbated it dramatically. And then we went, all right, forget it. We'll never do tariffs at that level again. All of these economic structures you're proposing don't work. And the only way you can pitch them is to not tell the full story to people. And then they end up lied to, which is typical for Donald Trump.
So for the past 10 years, we've actually had goods deflation of about -2% a year, that things in the goods sector have gotten cheaper over time. So it's absolutely true that things can get cheaper over time and it not necessarily spell economic doom. The second
Mm-hmm.
thing, by the way, is that Donald Trump hasn't even assumed office yet, and you've already written his obituary with respect to price changes.
He can't do
Give
it.
the man, give the man a chance. Let's
What
increase
would he do?
excess capacity. Well, you've already said what he would do. He would drill, baby, drill. He would increase
That's not going to
energy.
reduce prices.
Why wouldn't it? If it
You know
costs
what? You know
more,
why? I can tell you right now. You want to know why? Because Joe Biden already produces more oil domestically right now than Donald Trump ever did. Doesn't do shit for prices. So why would it be different with Trump?
do you think oil production could go up more from here or not?
Of course it could, but do you really believe that the reason that things are more expensive is because of energy costs?
Well, there's not ever one single reason that drives a massive change in
Right.
inflation like we've
Exactly.
seen.
So besides energy, what else is Trump going to be able to? Because
Well,
here's the thing: you and I both know most presidents can't do a lot to make prices change. They don't have that kind of massive power. There are certain things they can try, but the concept of him promising I'll lower prices is really out of his hands, and that's why I'm saying he can't do it. I'm not saying he can't do it because I think he's inept. I'm saying he can't do it because he literally can't do it.
let's wait for the results. Again, this is
Well,
not it's well look, it's one of those things that we can debate ourselves blue in the face, but
yeah,
ultimately we will judge him by his results. I do believe that there will be outright deflation in certain categories of goods under the next 4 years by
sure,
cutting energy costs, by increasing excess supply in the economy. Well, I
absolutely,
think it's a great policy to no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. You know what that does,
I
by the way,
agree.
for millions of Americans who are working on the sidelines, who says, look, I don't want to work right now because the government's just taking too much of my paycheck. You know what it says to them? It's time to get back in the game. It's time to increase the labor supply in a way that, by the way, lowers prices. When more folks are working, that means that you have a much more competitive environment for workers, and that allows some of those wage pressures to come off.
I agree
And
with you.
so, I think that's where we are.
I mean, I'll give you this one 100% because I remember when Trump came out and said he wanted to do the no tax on tip stuff. I said, God, that's a really good idea. Harris should steal that idea, and she did. It didn't work out.
She stole that and a lot of things, other things,
Yeah,
but
she definitely she stole that. In my head I was like, man, that's a it's just a great campaign tactic, but B, it's a good idea. I'm not sitting here going, hey, every idea Trump has is bad. Trump is across the board a horrendous president. Like there are certain things that I could look at and go, good idea, that's fine, and I'm happy to give him his flowers when he deserves them. But when he outright lies about his capability to make massive changes that people voted directly for, that's where I'm like, well, let's be realistic about what he can actually do.
yeah, I mean, look, he didn't promise to unilaterally pass a constitutional amendment. That would literally be impossible. But
Sure.
the idea that it is literally impossible for Donald Trump to work with Congress to use executive action to increase oil production, to increase excess supply in the economy, to bring in a way that lowers prices, that's absolutely possible, plausible,
Sure,
probable.
of course.
And so I just think it's one of those things that it's almost in the too hard bucket to even talk about now. We just have to see the results of it.
Oh, we
And by the
will.
way, I think that you, in many respects, want to be wrong on this because what it will mean is that prices come down for hardworking people who have
Sure.
really gotten a rough hand of things over the last 4 years.
Absolutely. I would love to be wrong. Across the board, I'd love to be wrong. I think that, coming into this term, a lot of people on my side of the aisle are very concerned about how it's going to go. And a lot of it we want to be wrong on. We want Trump to come. Like, I know, I mean, look, there are people on the left unquestionably who want him to fail. And there are people on the right who want Joe Biden to fail because they just want their side to win. I'm on the side of America. You're on the side of America. I want us to do well. The reason I get so angry about how Trump is approaching it is that I just, I'm a data driven person and I look at the data of what he's presenting and go, it's not going to work. Like it's great that you're saying it's going to work. And it's one thing to say, yeah, sure, we're going to wait and see the results. And you're right, we will. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see the results in a negative way. I'd love to be wrong, but data says I'm not. And, it's possible I am. Data can be wrong too eventually, but usually it's not. So, we've obviously gone through a wide gauntlet of different things that we've talked about here, but they are somewhat interrelated. But I think going back to the original point of like, I think it just comes down to how we're prioritizing what the outcome is going to be, right? So
Well, that's
my
right. That's everything. That's everything,
right,
by the way. What do you
exactly,
prioritize more? Do you prioritize good jobs in America or cheap air
right.
fryers, t-shirts, and avocados, right? I mean, that's what it is. That's
But that's
exactly
not what
what
it
it
is.
is.
No, it's do you prioritize at prices for everyday Americans or jobs for everyday Americans?
Yeah,
That's the
jobs are more important than
I think
prices.
prices are more important because in the end, prices affect everybody. Jobs only
Would you
affect
rather
the
have
people who get them.
Well, that's not true because one person's spending is another person's income. So if you're out of work, the effects will ripple through the entire economy. That's what made 2008 so
But that's the
pernicious.
case now.
Folks lost work. What's the case now?
If these people are out of work now, it's not happening to the economy. The economy is healthy right now.
Maybe in Atlanta it is. It's certainly not in Biloxi, Mississippi. It's certainly not in
How
Appalachia. It's
so?
certainly not in
Give me
Youngstown,
a
Ohio.
metric of how it's not healthy.
Well, the fact that 7 million working age men are not working, that's not healthy. That's
Give
not
me one. You've
normal.
said that one 3 times. Give me another one. Give me
That
a basic measurement of the economy that is doing poorly right now.
Absolutely. A third of American parents think that their children's life will be less good than their own
That's not
life.
an economic metric
Why isn't it?
because it's not. That's not how you measure the success or failure of the economy.
I mean, I don't want to measure it based on what hedge fund managers are contributing
That's not what I'm
or,
asking
or, or
either.
what the stock market is doing, right? The fact
What's
of the
the gross
matter is that,
domestic product? What's the inflation rate? What's the stock market doing?
I
These
mean,
are typical basic things. They're all doing well.
no, sure, but my point is that those things are disconnected from the struggles of
Correct.
everyday
And I'm the
Americans.
one saying that prices are the important thing, and you're the one saying jobs are the important thing when prices are the direct effect on people. That's more important. And tariffs do not prioritize that. Tariffs prioritize the opposite. And even then, you're not going to be able to necessarily force these companies into repatriating their work because look, I have a friend of mine who's a CEO of an aerospace company where essentially they like inspect and airplane parts and repair them and all that stuff. And they deal quite a bit with the EU and they buy a lot of their products from there. I asked him before we had this debate of like, what's your take on this? Because he deals with it firsthand all the time. And I asked him, okay, because I knew that there was going to be a discussion around, would we repatriate jobs? And he said he would need, and I'm not kidding, a 270% tariff to go into effect to justify economically moving jobs from overseas to the United States. That is not what Trump is proposing. So a lot of these companies are just going to make prices higher for people and not repatriate their work because
So,
the difference between American labor and foreign labor is so extreme that it
so
requires a massive tariff to accomplish the goal that you're talking about.
a 270% price increase on $100 part on a commercial airliner, the cost
It's
of
not.
which is
These are like
amortized over millions
tens
of
of thousands of
individual.
dollars in the parts.
Great. But I mean, okay, so that's fine. So I don't know anything about this example, but what I would say is that fine. If this altimeter or whatever goes from being $10,000 to $37,000 on a
Mhm.
$100 million plane.
Yeah.
And if that means that those things can now be manufactured outside of New Haven, where I take the Acela into town, when I see that and say, okay, we're going to employ 500 people, and now Boeing has to charge a little bit more
But it's
to
not just him.
JetBlue.
It's everybody. It's every industry is going to be like that. It's not
That's
just
not true.
selective.
That's
In
not
of
true.
course it is. Of course it is.
That's
Because in
not
the
true.
end, what's the one difference that's going to be the most cost change? What's going to cause the most cost change? Labor cost.
Well,
That
it
is
wouldn't.
true.
You wouldn't
That's
need a
true across
270%
every
tariff on
industry.
avocados to make them
Of,
economically
of course you
viable here
would.
in the United
Of course you
States.
would. How much do you think you pay the average illegal immigrant versus how much you're going to be required to pay the average American? It's at
So I
least a
want to give
370%
Americans jobs.
increase.
I don't want to give illegal immigrants jobs. I also don't want to exploit them. They're currently being exploited,
But that's
Zach.
not my point. That's
They're
about you're
being
changing the
exploited.
subject. I'm
You know,
talking about
you
prices.
know
I'm
what was
talking
cheap
about the
labor? You know what
cost.
was cheap labor? Slavery. It didn't make it okay.
That wasn't cheap labor.
Slavery
That
was
was
cheap
free
labor.
labor. That's not the
Well, it
same.
was it was certainly cheap labor, okay? It was wrong. It was cheaper
Of
than
course it was.
actually
It's
paying
slavery.
Black Americans for their contributions.
I'm
And so
not
my point
advocating
is,
for this. I'm just saying that there's a difference in price that is massive that would require people to pay dramatically more to make their product in America. Therefore, they would not do it on a 25% tariff. It's not enough.
How does New Balance manage to make their sneakers in the United States and so but Nike doesn't and they charge virtually the same price? How?
I look,
How does
that's corporate
Tesla
greed.
manage? How does Tesla manage? How does Tesla
Well,
manage to make
Tesla,
the Model
talk about
3,
Tesla,
the
they're
Model
losing
Y,
their
the
sales.
Cybertruck? How do they manage to make those cars here but
I'm not
other
saying it's
car companies
impossible.
can't?
Well,
But
Teslas
I'm
are
saying
very
but I mean
expensive.
to your point, if
Most people
American
can't afford a
manufacturing is so
Tesla.
much more expensive,
It
why do
is.
Tesla and New Balance make their products here? And these products, if anything, are somewhat slightly cheaper than the competitive
Teslas are not
offerings.
cheaper.
Teslas are absolutely cheaper than these imported foreign cars. Absolutely, they are. A Tesla Model 3 costs
Sure.
$29,000.
Yeah. But that's, come on. Nobody. I'm talking about the whole suite of Tesla versus the whole suite of Ford, for example.
Okay,
Like I drive a Bronco, that's expensive,
New Balance
but
sneakers
a
are not
Taurus
200
isn't.
New Balance sneakers are not 270% more expensive than Nike sneakers. They're
Of course
not.
not, and that's where
They're
corporate
not. So
greed comes
hold
into
on.
the
How did they
mix
manage to do that? How did they manage to do that?
by
By
being a different
employing
corporate structure.
good people in this country.
Well, that's the threshold for their profit margin. Look, I'm not arguing in favor of this. What I'm saying is that yes, could you theoretically do that? But what you're describing is a situation where you're telling Nike, "Hey, you're going to have to rethink your entire profit margin structure," which is not a simple thing to do. I'm not saying it's not morally correct. It is. What you're describing is morally
No,
correct, and I'm sure
Nike
a
doesn't
lot
have
of
to do
Bernie
Nike
Sanders
doesn't
people
have
would
to do
be
this.
happy with it.
Nike can continue to use migrant cheap slave labor in China. They don't have to do this. They're just going to pay the tariff and suffer the consequences as a
Well, they'll
result for
just pay the
using
tariff. They
migrant
won't
labor.
repatriate their jobs because it's not 25% is not going to be enough to justify
Look,
it if the difference in labor
if
cost is that
Nike
extreme.
goes bankrupt off the tariffs, good. That's more business for companies like New Balance that are actually making in America and
Look,
employing
what about all the jobs
good.
that are lost for Americans in Nike? That's not good.
They'll get hired by
It's
New
too
Balance
simplified. That's what I'm saying. Is
with
like your
all the
arguments
big
are too
business.
simple. You're simplifying it too much. If
Common
Nike
sense.
goes bankrupt, it's
Those people will
hundreds
be
of
hired by
thousands of
New Balance because
jobs.
there's going to be new
New
demand for
Balance
New
won't.
Balance sneakers
You're
that are going to be made
describing
up from the
market
Nike.
shifts that take so much time. It's not like it just happens overnight.
If
You're going to
Nike
have
shareholders
suffering
lose
during
all
that
their
time.
money, that's not my concern. My concern is
I don't care about the
people having a
shareholders.
job. Well, I mean, that's what happens when a company goes bankrupt. The shareholders get wiped out. But
Yeah,
my
but the
point
people
is,
who work for them lose their jobs too. That's who I care about.
that's right, and they will
And they're
be
not all going to get hired
employed.
by New Balance. It's just not going to
Look,
happen.
my point is that clearly, if New Balance sneakers are not 270% more expensive than Nike sneakers, that clearly you can make in America.
Of course you
Companies
can.
should stop using and exploiting people. They're people, whether
Agreed.
they're in China, whether they're in Guatemala, whether they're in Georgia, they are people. Stop exploiting people.
I agree with
Stop it
that.
and hire good Americans. The cool thing about hiring Americans, by the way, is that we have labor unions that are fighting on behalf of them for a fair wage, a decent
Not that
wage,
many anymore. I mean, some, but
a fair wage and a decent wage, that they're not being put through a situation where they, like a young 14-year-old boy, Marcos Cruz, lost his arm working at a Purdue factory in rural Virginia. He was a
mhm.
migrant. He was exploited. So he didn't have the same worker protections as someone in
Sure.
America would have had. And so again, there's a bigger picture. I'm not just saying hire American because we love the flag. I'm saying hire American because these are better workers. They're more reliable workers. Oh, and here's the best part. They actually are being employed with morality and not being exploited.
We can agree on all that 100%. The challenge that I have is not the principle of the whole thing that you're centering this on. I agree with you on the principle of all of this. I want American manufacturing. I want all this stuff to happen. The point I'm making is that when you get into this discussion for real and you start to actually look at what it will take, this will take many, many years, a lot of time, a lot of change, and a lot of struggle. And the struggle is going to come from regular people paying more for that transition to happen. There are maybe slower, but more cost effective for regular people ways to
Well,
incentivize
the
that
price of
manufacturing
Nike
shift.
sneakers are gonna go up and they can buy New Balances. I mean, the
Of
price of
course.
Toyotas are gonna go up and they can buy Teslas. I mean, I just don't understand. There's obvious substitution effects here. Your entire argument rests that Americans cannot substitute the Nikes for the New Balances. They absolutely can, they will, and they should.
They can over time, not overnight. And you also,
Overnight, yes. If Nike prices go up, you don't have to buy those sneakers. That can literally happen overnight.
yeah, that can happen overnight, but the shift that's required to go through all of this change is
Economies are
extreme.
constantly transforming. Joseph
But
Schumpeter's
but it's
creative
not just about
discussion.
the
There are
economy.
losers, there are winners.
We're
It
talking about
happens.
manufacturing. Manufacturing requires facilities. We don't have all the facilities
New
to
Balance
just.
is making the sneakers right
This is
here
one
in America.
example. This is one example. I'm talking about every single industry, not just shoes. When you get into the details of how difficult it will be to make this shift, it's not just like overnight, all this happens. There are certain industries where we just don't have the infrastructure to take it on right now. And it's going to cost a ton of money for these companies to repatriate their jobs. And where do you think they're going to make that cost up? They're going to make it up in the cost of their product, which is going to make things more expensive. That is the problem. I'm not saying that we shouldn't endeavor to have America be a manufacturing country again. I think we should. I think there are much smarter ways to do it that don't require people to pay more money, because you can slowly affect the market to make it so you don't have to shock the system with a tariff and make everything more expensive overnight. You can give incentive to companies to offset the cost through different tax codes, different tax code examples, different regulations you can put in place to give them advantages to being American manufacturers. Those are systems that we can just make very robust, and we don't have to pass the cost on to people because the cost will come from the government supporting it. That I can get behind. But this idea that the people of this country need to pay for America to become a manufacturing country again, that to me is a mistake, because in the end people are suffering from a price situation right now, and they need it to, at least somewhat be mitigated. And the only way that's going to happen is if you do the opposite of what we're describing here with tariffs. It's not going to go that way. If we go with tariffs, it's going to make it worse.
Like I said, the substitution effects are possible. Companies are already manufacturing here in America and not doing so at a much, much higher cost, as you can see, with everything from Teslas to New Balances to the fruit that's
What
grown
about an iPhone?
far, not too far from where I am. I absolutely, by the way, the Mac Pro is manufactured in the United States. Absolutely, you could manufacture the
You know how
iPhone.
much a Mac Pro costs? It's extremely expensive.
Well,
This would not cost $1,000. It just
okay.
wouldn't.
Well, remember, the average American upgrades their iPhone every 4 years. So if you went from spending $1,000 to $1,200, which is
It wouldn't be
amortized on
1,200.
a financing schedule, then look, like I said, there's always going to be trade-offs. You're not, there are no solutions, as Thomas Sowell said.
The
There are only
trade-off's the price.
trade-offs.
That's
The
the point.
trade-off is price on a product that you buy once every 4 years is going to
Let's
get 20% more expensive.
just what about the 20% of food that's more expensive now? What about that?
Well,
I
no,
mean,
it's not. It's not going to be 20% more expensive. You said 20%
no,
of
20%
food.
of food, not 20% more expensive. I'm saying, what about the 20% of food that it will be more expensive?
Almost,
Why do we need
almost,
to do that?
almost all food can be grown here in the United States. So again, you can shift
But
that
it
supply.
currently isn't. That's the of course you can shift it, but I'm saying, like, you don't just press the shift button. You end up
Look,
having to do a whole
if
systemic
you are
change to how you do this.
sincere, if you are sincere, and I believe that you are, I believe that you care about this issue.
I
If
do.
you are sincere that you want to have good paying jobs for Americans of all walks of life,
Of
there's
course.
going to be a transition period. There are going to be bumps on the road. And as Dr. King said, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step. There are going to be there's going to be some
This isn't
transition.
a
There's
bump
going to
in
be
the
some
road, though.
bumps.
This is not a bump in the road. This is an aggressive shock to the system. This is a piano in the middle of the highway. This is not a bump in the road.
Well, fortunately,
I'm fine with the bump in the road.
fortunately, I have Tesla version 13 FSD to navigate around that piano, and perhaps
You do.
we'll end
A
on that
person
note.
driving a Ford pickup from 25 years ago is going to crash into that thing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Well,
talking
guess
about.
what? If you crash into it, you'll make a melody, the sonata of those keys slanging together. So. Well, Zach, it was definitely a lively debate. And I think, like all good debates, it often gets tangential. It kind of goes off, it veers here, it
Sure.
goes there. We talked about COVID, we talked about migrants, we talked about fentanyl, we talked about New Balance and Nike and Tesla. But I think the most important thing is that we both think this is an important issue. The economy matters. We
Sure.
both, I think, agree that wherever you stand on the particular tariff debate, you agree that there's a good intention behind potentially the idea of reviving American manufacturing and
Sure.
getting Americans, like I mentioned, now this is the fourth time, 7 million working age men who are not working. That's a problem that needs a real solution. Now, we obviously disagree that tariffs can be part of that solution, but I think we leave it at there and we say, look, urgent issue, definitely significant. We acknowledge the core problem that tariffs might be trying to address. But at the end of the day, disagreements like these exist. And I think we both agree that if Donald Trump succeeds on this issue, that means America succeeds. And I think
Sure.
you and certainly I will welcome President Trump's success on that over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. If regular people can be doing better and Trump does a good job doing it, great. I'll give him a pat on the back and say good job. And I agree. Like, look, in the end, I think what I took away from this debate, which I agree was nice and lively, was we both care about America. I mean, really, that's like we have a different vision for how it's going to come together, and I think we do have different priorities, especially on this issue of jobs versus costs, and short term risk versus long term gain. That's all open for debate. But
Yeah.
in the end, I'm happy that we had a chance to do this debate. I think a lot of people are talking about this and want to see both sides of it without the other person, saying something egregiously horrendous about the other person on the other side of the argument. So still respect you. Think you're a good guy. Don't agree with your opinion. I think I would imagine you feel the same about me. And that's kind of the premise of this whole show, is that we can walk away at the end and go, I don't agree with this guy, but I still, I think he's got the best intentions in mind. And, hopefully we'll have a lot more issues to bring to the table and have the same outcome.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, have a good one, everybody.